What's happening, boy? Good?
I'm good, my man. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, mate. Thanks for coming on.
I appreciate it, but it's going to be a good one.
So for anybody who doesn't... Sorry, I'm just drinking. For anyone who doesn't know, this is Ross. He is... well, I'll let you introduce yourself. Who are you, bro?
Yeah, for sure, man. So as Ryan alluded to, I'm Ross. I am one of the physique and prep coaches from the Muscle Mentors. A lot of people would know that Callum is currently Ryan's coach. He's also mine. And I've been working kind of under Callum as his mentee, if you will, for the past... He's an incomprehensible amount of time at this stage, but I've kind of spent the past couple of years really centering my kind of education and my focus around kind of managing the expectations of physique athletes and bringing people through, appropriate stack design, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today, and just giving people a kind of genuine, well-oiled understanding of kind of how to approach these things, what to expect, what kind of things to be thinking about when it comes to kind of delving into this space, and giving people kind of a legitimate understanding of how to go about this in a way that's not going to fuck them. And that's, in a basic sense, kind of what I've been doing. And of course, on the other side of that, I am a prep coach as well. I coach athletes from the amateur level right up to the pro level, right, hunting their pro cards. So very, very lucky to be in the position I'm in, and very thankful for Ryan for having me on.
Yeah, this is today what kind of we want to discuss about is we literally just spoke off air then when I first started out bodybuilding, the misconception or the ill knowledge that we got from people in the gym, just from hearsay, an actual no backing of obviously how to design a cycle, what considerations you need to take before actually even starting a cycle, and then also how to escalate that cycle, isn't it? So, for example, let's take a scenario. First off, like, how do you feel? Is age a factor of when you should start? I have a lot of people who say to me, "Oh, well, when I'm 18 or when I'm 21." What do you feel about it being an age-dependent thing?
Yeah, I think you can argue both sides of that one. Like if you have some absolute freak who just shows up in the gym and like this person has the potential to take it all the way, and their willingness to take it all the way is there. Like if you have someone who's unbelievably good and they're aware of the risks and you're maybe working with somebody who understands it to the same degree that we do, then yeah, I think you can potentially make an argument for that person starting to sustain a kind of longer term, safer escalation model from the age of maybe 18, 19. I think if you're outside of that kind of 18, 19 back, that's when it gets a little bit weird. And even then, in most cases from a kind of moral perspective, you want to be probably in your 20s before you take that leap. You still have a lot of young age things that you need to do. I think there's a massive misconception that people have. Like there's a certain level of kind of social experience that people need when you grow up. And I had this conversation with a fellow who I used to coach, and he was very, very young. And he wasn't with me when he jumped on, but he was very young when he did. And he devoted all of his time to bodybuilding very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And like I kind of had this conversation with like, when was the last time you went on a holiday? Like when was the last time you went out with your friends? Like when was the last time that you had a social interaction? And like he couldn't remember. Yeah. Like at the end of the day, I think that if you're somebody who knows that you maybe have this potential, you have this goal, you have this willingness to succeed in the sport, that's amazing. Don't ever let go of that. But also ask yourself, like, do you have some living to do before you take that step? Because Ryan will tell you, to be a pro athlete, you have to behave like a pro athlete. Mm-hmm. And, to kind of abandon that side of your life is something that you need to consider when it comes to age. But generally, kind of all that aside, I think you'd probably want to be within at least like your 20s. And there's no rule, there's no physiological regulation pattern that's kind of going on there in your 20s that says, okay, do it now. But generally, I think from a moral perspective, I would like to see somebody into their 20s or well into their 20s before deciding to make that step.
I think it takes a few good years of training experience. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, you might come out the gate at, say, 16. And luckily now we have coaches like me or yourself or Callum to help people then obviously understand how to set the nutrition up, understand how to set the training up. But I feel like people need a good 4 or 5 years. Well, yeah, a good 4 years of doing all the basics perfectly.
Yeah, and that's even the biggest precursor. Sorry, pardon me to cut across. That's even so. I probably should have mentioned that. Like even with that decision at a younger age, that's all done with the discrepancy that this individual is very much aware of what's needed to be done. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a fellow who doesn't really understand food, doesn't understand nutrition, doesn't understand managing sleep and lifestyle, I don't care what they look like. You're going nowhere near gear. Nowhere near. There's a certain.
The thing I would say to the younger people is, you need the experience. You need to understand that you can adhere to a plan. You can train in a fashion that needs to be trained in, and that you've eked out maximum amount of progress that you possibly can in that level. Because at the end of the day, I feel just to jump on cycle just to make quicker progress will only slow you down in the long run.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
You need an appreciation of the process itself. Like, you need to understand what it takes to go through that process, irrespective of drugs or not. Because I think what you'll learn, and what obviously me and you have learned from our endeavors into the use of assistance, is that it's not magic. You essentially, you have to make sure you're doing the same shit that you were doing before you started. All of a sudden, you just have another tool in the toolbox.
And the other thing is, as well, is if you don't have them things in place, then you're just risking your health for no reason.
Yeah, 100%.
You're literally just being detrimental to your health and not getting the most benefits out of it.
Yeah.
So let's take a scenario, say we're now currently 20 odd years of age. We've been training a good 3 to 4 years, got our nutrition in place and so on. I think, as we spoke about, the misconception is that the initial cycle, back in the day, it was 2 mil of this and 2 mil of that, always for some reason, sus and deca, but which is way beyond what you should be doing. But how would you set that? Let's take a scenario as, say, myself. I'm a young guy. I've just come into body. I've been training 4 or 5 years or 3 years perfectly, got nutrition, made great progress. I'm now at that turning point where I want to jump into assisted. What would you say would be the protocol?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you got to do with anyone is assess them as an individual. What are their experiences? Like, what did they actually think about this realm? Because I think when you go into the assisted space, and especially if you're going in there with preconceptions of what it's supposed to look like, if you're going in there with the advice of the big fella in the gym, this is what this coach is going to say to you, and then you come to someone like me and that's not what they say to you, you have to go in there to be very open-minded. So when we look at potentially the approach that we take with longer term assistance models, that's a big thing that needs to be put out there. So the model that I tend to use is a longer term model, in the sense that you're not going to be running like, a 12-week cycle, an 8-week cycle, a 16-week cycle, because in reality, where these kind of like almost arbitrary dates come from within stack design, like within like, okay, I'm doing a 12-week cycle, you're doing a 16-week cycle, is largely from the length of research papers. So the length of the research that they've done on these hormones are largely 16-week studies. So what's been taken from that is like, okay, we have to do 16-week cycles. Really, that's not really how it works. Time isn't really a factor for the most part. It's more tolerance. So time tolerance, that's more so what we're looking at. So what we need to look at is, okay, where's this person at? What is their space? Let's just take them as a general, has potential, has what they need. We're not going to put them on any kind of continuum. We're going to put them on the basic approach that one would take in terms of like managing it from any level. So what we need to look at is okay, what are we going to do initially? And the first thing that you do is go in with a basal dose of testosterone alone. That's what you do. You go in a basal sole dose of testosterone. And normally what we do is we use the reference range of TRT to give us the kind of realm by which we go into that. So I think the ranges of TRT change country per country, but I'm pretty sure the average is between 125 a week and 250 a week. I believe that's kind of where we go. Me personally, depending on the individual, depending on the muscularity, the potential of that individual, I like to go to the higher end of that chain. And so do they. Because you're trying to sustain progressions, really. You're trying to put them in a place where they are in a progressive environment. And, if you're going in with legitimate TRT, and we know the stress can be well sustained at that higher end of TRT, why not go in at that kind of top end dose? So about 150 to 200. There are people out there who can't tolerate more than that. But there are people who have coached in the past who cannot tolerate that. And what I mean by tolerate, I'm going to bring it back to a secondary point, is that all of us as individuals have a kind of biological inter-individual response, our kind of tolerance to testosterone, in the sense that there is a certain amount that we can take in, and this is just testosterone alone, a basal dose of testosterone. There is a certain amount that we can take in, and after that, we will start to experience negative side effects, be that estrogenic side effects from over-aromatization, be that just general kind of oily skin, whatever the kind of kickback you're going to get is, we will start to run into blockades so far as our ability to continue to titrate that dose. So normally the first kind of step that we take, and I have to admittedly, I don't always take this step with people. So normally what we take is we start to bring that dose up north until we hit that threshold, until we start to get that kickback, until we start to get, okay, this is probably where this person belongs. Again, Ryan, you'll know this, I'll know this from experience and anecdote, that tends to be no more than about 250 to 300 milligrams a week. With most individuals. There are people who can tolerate 4, and there are people who can tolerate 5, 6, but in my experience, I've only met one person who tolerates well, over 400 milligrams of testosterone a week. One person.
Sorry, everything's frozen.
So you're kind of doing that over the course of I don't know, I would say anywhere between kind of 1 to 5 or 6 months. Again, there's a lot of things that you need to think about here when it comes to kind of your direct approach so far as time is concerned. But what we need to ask ourselves, okay, is what do we do next? And obviously you know this, and only up until a couple of years ago, this was like this school of thought in that you go 250, then you go 300, and then you go 5. And then once you hit 5, you put in some kind of other kind of super retentive compound like fucking DECA or MPP or EQ or something like that. And in reality, when we look at kind of why we use a basal dose of testosterone in the first place, this starts to kind of unravel and becomes a massive misconception. So generally, when we look at kind of basal doses of testosterone, the reason we're doing it is, of course, to have a substance of testosterone, but it's also to make sure that we maintain basal secretions of estrogen and DHT, both of which are incredibly important for progression, both of which are incredibly important for the body and overall health and the standardization of health. And obviously, people hear the word estrogen, especially as a man, and you're like, oh, fuck no. The issue oftentimes isn't really estrogen. The issue is the ratio of testosterone to estrogen. And when that starts to fucking go a little bit askew, that's when you start to deal with issues, which are arguably for males, from a kind of cosmetic perspective, the worst side effects that you can get: gyno, oily skin, horrific acne, general obviously mood disorders. Nobody wants to not be able to get it up and not be able to finish in bed. Again, all these things are fucking not ideal whatsoever. So what we do in that case is we'll then move into the realms of a potential DHT derivative. I like DHT derivatives, things like Primo, things like Mastron. They tend to work very, very well, mainly because they tend to have a lower affinity for estrogen. They don't bind to the estrogen receptor as easily as things like testosterone does. So this is a misconception as well. Mastron is often said to be used, quote unquote, as an AI. Okay, yeah. You can't use Mastron as an AI, but what you can do is you can layer in these DHT derivatives as a means of avoiding the use of an AI. Because what we need to understand is that when we're bringing in these drugs with lower affinities for estrogen, we can titrate them, and we can titrate them hard if needed. I personally have had, my Primo currently is 1,300 milligrams a week of Primo. This is what I'm on right now. I'm at peak end of off season. So that's by the way, yeah, it's expensive. It's expensive, Primo. It's expensive. Pinning money into my shoulder every couple of days. But yeah, I'm currently on a really high dose of Primo, kind of peak off season load. So you would find very, very few people. In fact, I don't know anyone. In fact, nobody, I believe, without the use of an AI or some other kind of cocktail of compounds to manage it, could run 1,300 milligrams of retentive compounds. Yeah. Things like Test, MPP, DECA. I don't think anyone could get to an accumulative dose of 1,300.
So just to clarify to obviously people watching. So once you found that threshold of obviously testosterone, say 200, 250. What is the reason, just to recap for them, what is the reason you wouldn't use EQ and you wouldn't use MPP and you wouldn't use...
So first of all, EQ is just kind of shit. EQ is like, not that it's, so all drugs, right? All androgenic drugs, all steroids, if you will, they all kind of permit and allow for the accretion of protein at the cell at about the same rate. They all kind of act at the androgen receptor and kind of relay that production of protein, which is essentially what muscle building is. It's kind of like a DNA expression is a similar kind of process. They do it all at about the same rate, okay? So no one drug is stronger than another drug, no matter what anyone tells you. Unfortunately, it's just not the fucking case. What you need to weigh, and the way that we need to look at drugs, is drugs are really good at some things and they're really bad at some other things, or they're just not good at those things. So every single steroid that we use was not made, nor was it created for us to look good. Most of them were used to some degree of medical deployment. Mastron was used in the treatment of breast cancer. I know that things like MPP have been used in the things of just like general kind of muscle wasting disease. This is where a lot of these drugs come from. Okay, so why do we use these drugs? Why do we choose one over the other? Largely, it's orientated around how they act at the receptor site and the other jobs that they do. So MPP is what's called a 19-neurotestosterone. It's a derivative of testosterone that's quite similar to testosterone in of itself, and that's why we still call it a 19-nor. So that will also relay quite a high affinity for estrogen. MPP will. One of the reasons why MPP makes you so fucking watery is its action over estrogen. Anyone who you know who uses MPP or DECA and MPP are quite similar. They'll often tell you a couple of things. A, they feel watery and big, and that their joints feel fucking fantastic. There's this kind of like lubricative action at the joint. And that's not the only reason you do MPP. MPP, again, because it's modulations of estrogen, because it's high affinity for estrogen, which is an anabolic compound in of itself, you're potentially getting benefit from that.
So people know, because a lot of people won't understand. MPP and DECA are very similar. It's just the ester on it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like just a slightly different. There's different kind of a lot of the drugs that we look at. So we look at different esters. The difference in them is largely kind of how they're broken down and the time by which they're broken down and their kind of uptake rate, if you will. There's lots of different terms you can use to kind of rationalize it to yourself. But a lot of these drugs are quite similar. They're all kind of derivatives of something. Mm-hmm. So when we look at that, right, we need to understand that these drugs are then going to have action upon the cell in some degree and other cells and other kind of receptor sites. And some of those actions across receptor sites are going to be less desirable. And if we know that most of these drugs are accreting the goal that we want, are creating and kind of sustaining the goal that we're after, which is essentially protein accretion, okay, action, the kind of myonucleic action, we can smartly deploy these compounds relative to what we want to happen and what we don't want to happen. Mm-hmm. So we know that there's a certain benefit to having high secretions of estrogen. Estrogen is a very anabolic hormone in of itself. It's a very, very powerful, has very, very strong and powerful actions over hypertrophic outcomes. So that's why we want to have basal secretions of estrogen and basal secretions of DHT by using that baseline testosterone to whatever tolerable level you can get, because that is beneficial to have at a tolerable level. And then we start moving into the use of these DHT derivatives like primobolan and mastron, which are obviously going to have lower affinities for estrogen, but potential benefits of myonucleic action of driving protein accretion. Now, mastron has some kind of carryover to performance, one of the reasons why it's quite popular with powerlifters, and primobolan potentially has some benefits over mastron. But to be honest, I always say with primo and mastron, it's largely tomatoes. It's that kind of kind of discrepancy that you would use for the most part. So we use these compounds with lower affinities for estrogen for the reason as that we can continue to move our total androgen load north, because with drugs, more is more. Okay. And anyone who tells you otherwise is like, I get the whole idea of, like more, less is more, but in reality, more is more. The more you do, the more you get out of them. But if we're smart about how we kind of modulate our stack in a way, the allowance for us to do more and to sustain more and to get more out of less, which is something that we want to speak about as well, is far, far, far more beneficial. So that's kind of where we look at. So yeah, more drugs will produce more results, but the sustenance of their use is a very powerful thing to understand as well. So what I mean by that is when we use kind of like your bro style stack, so you've gone from walking to the gym, and you're saying, what, I'm going to jump on. There's a big dude training people in the gym. I'm going to go ask him. They'll say, okay, cool, man, 500 test, 500 deca, whatever kind of, shite he throws out that there. You've gone from a very low androgen load. In fact, you've gone from zero, essentially, zero exogenous androgen load to, a gram and a half. The body's ability to sustain that level of stress is in a delicate balance. You will not be able to sustain that for a long-term period, okay? You'll just be able to go for as far as it can go, and then you will eventually have to stop as your body will start to fight back at you. Where the difference lies in terms of how we think about things now and how the general school of thought is starting to shift, thanks to people like Victor Black, Joe Jeffrey in particular. Massive shout to Joe as well. Joe's taught me an awful lot about what I do. So massive shout out to Joe. Obviously Callum as well. And the way that we're thinking about these things now is over a longer term period. Mm-hmm. So we escalate our dose over a longer term. Okay, maybe the accumulative dose is quite similar, maybe a little bit more, but because we're spreading the load over a longer term period, we can make adjustments, assess the response, gauge whether this is an okay thing that we've done, and then move from there. It is a long-term needs analysis basis of stack design. And that's where we start to need to understand things, is that we're looking at the person. What do they need at any given time? What do we do relative to that need? What is the response of that adjustment? And do we need to do anything else? Yeah. Let's look at a negative example. We go from 300 testosterone. We see that's super, super tolerable and say, okay, Ryan, let's go to 400. And you immediately start to get negative kickback, sensitivity in the nipples, just general emotional stress. That's an immediate sign that small adjustment that we've made is obviously not something that we should do. We simply just pull it back. You're allowing yourself to make adjustments and to kind of read the room, so to speak, before it's too late. You throw 2,000 people into a room and say, pick one person. I want this guy. I want you to find them. It's very, very difficult.
It's the same as when for me, when I'm carving somebody up. You can't carve somebody up, and you can't just go, there's your 3-day plan, because it's assessed meal by meal, because you need to obviously assess what's going on and then make adjustments to that. That's what people don't understand with coaching. Coaching is very, very person dependent. And it's exactly the same with the stack design. It's some like yourself, you could tolerate what are you on 1,300? 1,300 primo?
300 tests and the rest is primo.
So but some people might not be able to. You just again, it's all individual. So to say to somebody, oh well, you run 500 mega deca, you run 500 mega test as well, is just ludicrous, really. It's just stupid, isn't it?
Exactly.
But
It's just it lacks substance. Do you know what I mean?
with the so for example, let's just refer back to so people know. So how long do you feel someone would stay on the tolerable like say 250 test and before they need to
yeah, so I like to say that the time between, you know, the introduction of testosterone, and this is somebody who's kind of at a very entry level, you know, this is the kind of person I'm speaking about. From the time, now again, you can't really put this down on direct. You can't say exactly how long this is going to take, but generally from the start to kind of like the introduction of that first DHT derivative. Now, of course, that's going to be dependent on just how high their tolerable dose is. But let's say it is 300. You know, I would say you're looking at anywhere between 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
No, I would say is what you're looking at there, to be honest with you. Again, depending on the person, what their goal is, like if they have an immediate show goal or something in a year and a half's time, because you have to sometimes shift the continuum north at points. And that's why I always, when I do these podcasts and these appearances, I always do kind of put the disclaimer out there that there are situations in the way that I coach people and the athletes who I look after, where I do take the executive decision to move them more north of the continuum than other people will. People who have
it's goal thing,
it's goal dependent. So like where somebody starts on this quote unquote kind of escalation protocol is potentially going to be governed by where they're at as an athlete, where their potential is, what their age is, what their time frame is. But the general approach and the general kind of foundational conditions that we apply are the exact same.
Yeah. 100%.
You escalate on a needs analysis relative to that individual, no matter where the fuck they start or where they are. And this is where it becomes a bit of an issue at times. And now obviously I know you spoke to Cal about kind of blasting and cruising last week, and this where these things start to come into play and kind of what we blast on, what we cruise on. It's a similar kind of setup, because when you learn more and more about how these drugs act on the body and how there are kind of discrepancies between what's written quote unquote on paper and then what's happening kind of physiologically, you'll soon begin to learn that there are certain tolerabilities of androgen load that people will have, in terms of you can have the same kind of reflective response that you would quote unquote cruising at a slightly higher load than you would be aware of that you could actually do that on, you know. So, you know, I've had people cruise on like 300 a week, you know, and that kind of thing. And are you directly cruising? No, probably not in the definitive sense, but are you kind of obtaining some of the, you know, the benefits of doing that same thing? Yeah, you are. You're starting to see your blood work improve. You're starting to see the overall.
Is that 300 meg total?
Yeah, total load. Like you can sustain it across multiple compounds. Like the highest, I've used myself as an example because I think it's a kind of, you know, it's easier for me to put myself. I have once cruised. My previous cruise was 450. And that was a combination of 250 tests and 200 prima bola.
And did the 250 put you back into a normal?
Technically that did, because you can't necessarily read primo and blood work. You know, but the actual testosterone dose would have. But in reality, I probably wasn't at a physiological range. You know, when you have the primo in circulation there as well. But the kind of the desired outcomes were the same. Or at least they were acceptable. You know, me as a slightly heavier individual, like I walk around about 110. You know, and the kind of level of muscularity that I have is not ridiculous, but it was enough for myself and Callum to decide that we're going to make an executive decision here to use a slightly higher androgen load. You know, to kind of sustain my progressions and then potentially trickle in other ancillary compounds, which is not necessarily the subject of this podcast itself, but things like growth hormone and insulin and stuff like that were also ticking off in the background to help me there. And that was kind of what we can do. So it just kind of shows that there is a certain level of personability with all this. That's the only reason I bring that up, is that, you know, we can't box ourselves in to absolutes, in the sense that we can't just say 500 tests, 500 decade, go for it. You know, we need to look at these things objectively. We need to say, okay, how do we actually approach this relative to this individual? And, you know, that first kind of stage, you know, that kind of 0 to 6 month mark, you know, is very largely orientated around the needs analysis. And there's a certain part of it's kind of following a protocol. Like you can follow a pattern. Like if you're somebody who really wants to get into this space, you know, and go down the assisted route, and maybe you don't have the money for a coach or something like that. Now, I always advise, if you're going to go into this space, you don't understand it, always invest in the coach. It should be a precondition to doing it.
That's kind of what I wanted to gauge on this, because I know a lot of younger guys are wanting to jump over, and then they just don't get a coach. And that's the issue we've got, is where you'll find. And then what we then as coaches have to do is rectify all this when they actually do come to us eventually, when they're like 12 weeks deep and they've been running ridiculous cycles. So for me, this is rather give them some sort of information to get them obviously on the right path, rather than obviously them doing fucking 500 tests and 500 deaths.
Exactly. And it's like
when someone, so another question a lot of people will ask is, so when do they, if they're running a six month sort of module and design of a stack, when would they get blood work then? When should they?
So I kind of have conversations with this a lot with people. And people will come to me and they'll say, okay, I want to go assisted. I'm like, cool, grand. I rarely get people who are in that entry level anymore. Most of the guys who come to me are already assisted or they've already fucked themselves up somehow and are fixing things in the first couple of months. But for the most part, like if you're somebody who's never used before, it is a pretty good idea to have blood work straight away before you start. For largely one reason and one reason only, to see how much of a difference there is between your natural circulating testosterone and the difference that's made by your first entry level deployment of testosterone in that time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you absolutely need to do that? You could say yes, you could say no. Mm-hmm. Because in reality, what a coach wants to know is, cool, how much has that made a differential? Cool. And then following that, I like blood work, depending on where they are. So I think someone like myself and like yourself, who are potentially running a slightly higher risk model year round, I think we need to look at every 6 to 8 weeks.
Yes,
just to make sure that are keeping things in relative circulation. I think we need to look at that objectively and, make sure that we're keeping things in a good space in that regard. Mm-hmm. And then I think on the flip side of that, I think somebody who's in that entry level, who we know are running slightly lower risk models with somewhat predictable outcomes at times, like there are somewhat predictable outcomes from the deployments that we make, especially during an experienced coach. You could probably go a little bit less frequently, every 12 weeks. Mm-hmm. But just for the sake of establishing that habit, I'd be going every 12 weeks. If you're not getting bloods for like 6, 7, 8 months, you need to kind of go check yourself a little bit and be like, like irrespective of whether the setup that you have is a low risk model, a high risk model, like if you're really not investing in your blood work, because usually what that means is that you're afraid to see it. Mm-hmm. In reality, that's normally what it is. So I would like to say every 12 weeks at the start. Get a round done, wait 12 weeks, get another round done. That's going to bring you to that kind of halfway point of that initial escalation. Another kind of 12 weeks, get to that point. Mm-hmm. When you start to bring in those secondary compounds after roughly, you're kind of looking at roughly 10 to 20 weeks or whatever, some kind of random range on it. Then you're starting to look at every 6 to 8 weeks. And predominantly, if you're going down the route of competitive kind of athlete space, which if you're assisted, you probably should be. It's really the only real justifiable reason to go down that space at all. Then you want to be looking at like every 8 weeks or so, just to make sure things are good, make sure to establish that point. Most blood work doesn't really run you up a bill of more than 150 quid. No, if you can't sustain 150 quid investment every 8 weeks, you got to ask yourself the question of what the fuck am I doing here?
Yeah, 100%. That's another thing as well, is down to before you take this, reverting right back to the start. But before you take this leap, you've got to understand the investment that it's going to cost you.
Yeah, 100%.
You can't really be doing this on a budget at the end of the day. So moving on to through blood work, I think the lack of knowledge as well is the supplementation, the health supplementation that is needed to be in place. Yes, it acts as a band-aid whilst we're on a cycle. However, going back from even myself, like I never knew about health supplementation till years ago. Do you know what I mean? Like I've been doing bodybuilding for 4 or 5 years before I even knew anything about how to supplement. So I think that's another thing. What do you feel like? Do you feel people need more education on what they need to be taking whilst on a cycle?
I think, again, tracking back to the original point of peeling it right back to the start, I think a really good practice. Now, have I actually did I do this myself? No, I didn't. I was like, I want to do gear because I want to get big. That was kind of my decision.
This is kind of why I want to do this, because that was what I did, and I kind of want to eliminate that from people.
And I kind of started in the kind of the beginning stages of people being a little bit more conscious. Do you remember when the kind of setup that everyone kind of went for was the start on 250, then go start to 125, then go 250, then go 5. Remember when that was the way everyone was doing it? I think Jordan set that up at one stage. That was his thing. It was when the JP forum was kicking off, and then I actually got really, really sick. Then about 7, 8 months, a year later after that, so not unrelated issue, but taking me off the smokes then. But that's not related. So I think one of the best things that you can do when you decide to go down this route, one, go and look at the amount of information that's available to you. Mm-hmm. But I personally think if you're somebody, right, and you go down this really stupid route of stack design, you clearly have not done fuck all research, because there is an incredible amount of information available. I've done at least 4 podcasts on this subject. Callum has done some podcasts with you. No Switch Fitness have unbelievable podcasts. Joe Jeffrey is probably one of the best resources available to anyone in respect to drugs and stack design. And, they have like really, really low entry point websites that you can just get really, really good, decent, concise, simplistic information off, that kind of way. So I always say to people, like, if you are going into this with less awareness, and maybe you do go down this kind of quote unquote silly route, you probably haven't done enough work in the background. But kind of going back, as I said, asking yourself, okay, what am I willing to do to go down this route? And what am I willing to invest in? What are the things that I need to be doing in order for me to go down this route? You need to be looking at regular health work, so blood work. You need to look at an ECG maybe once a year. You want to be looking at kind of making sure that you're getting your health supplementation in check. Like, health subs are more expensive than drugs are. Something maybe not mine, Primo's expensive, but but like in most cases you'll end up spending more on health supplementation in terms of kind of what you need to be looking at. A lot of health supplementation orientated around stack design is going to be largely around managing oxidative stress. So to kind of tell people a very simplistic way of what oxidative stress is, because you'll hear people tell you about this all the time and nobody fully knows really what it is. So oxidative stress is essentially the kind of production of these things called free radicals. And free radicals are kind of also known as reactive nitrogen species, is another term what they're called. And it's basically not having enough antioxidants to manage those oxidative stressors. And if you don't have enough antioxidants kind of in your kind of system to manage it, you will kind of create a net balance of oxidative stress that has more stress than antioxidant protocol, antioxidant management. Then you're going to be dealing with a lot of oxidative stress. One of the biggest things that us as athletes kind of do that causes high levels of oxidative stress is using anabolics. There's a large kind of upregulation of oxidative stress by the use of these drugs. And it's nothing to get away from. What else causes oxidative stress? Poor dietary habits, training, poor recovery, lack of sleep, and when you put these things kind of in, you're potentially dealing with a myriad and a cocktail of oxidative stress that's going to catch up on us. So in large part, one of the things that we do when it comes to managing supplementation is largely orientated around staying on top of oxidative stress. Things like glutathione are very good, and vitamin A, vitamin C, and melatonin is actually a very, very good antioxidant as well. And then we're looking at things like NAC, which is N-acetylcysteine. Is another really, really good one. So, there's a lot of basal kind of supplementation that you can use. Generally, you want an on-cycle support, something that supports liver, kidneys. The Strom on-cycle support is very good. The Raw on-cycle supports are excellent. Liver and kidneys, very, very good. And the panel, I seen the panel about the other day. It's very, very good. There's a couple of other kind of, branded things that we can use there. But in general, I'll try to avoid the use of brands going forward. But in general, you want to make sure that you're staying on top of that and that you're aware of like what's necessary and kind of has to be in place before you go down that route. Yeah, in the earlier stages, they're maybe not as, absolutely essential, but in eventuality, the more you do, the more you need. There is going to be a certain level of awarenesses that you need to have and kind of covering those baseline markers that you need to uptake, and it's all well and good watching people like yourself who kind of have worked so hard that they have sponsors who do it. They're going to, what you have to take into your own consideration that you're going to have to invest in that, and then
the investment that is, it's a big leap. It's obviously it's costly, and like you say, unless you're in this for the long term, and as you touched on, I feel like unless you're going to be truly competing and want to be one of the top athletes in the country, then really, like personally, for vanity, I wouldn't do it, not to this level, because there's just not the trade-off, the risk reward. There's not enough reward for the amount of risk and the amount of investment. Like at the end of the day, if you're not going to be making money back from this, or it's not going to give you some sort of enjoyment, then I don't feel like really anabolics is the route to go down. But yeah, I think that's the main thing with everybody is just understanding that the what they're actually doing and why they're doing it, rather than just aimlessly going, the big guy in the gym is literally following this protocol.
Just have a think about it when you decide to go down this space. There's literally an incredible amount of people out there who are available to you to either pay for consult with, because if you're someone that can't afford long-term coaching, okay, cool. I'm not going to question as to why you can or can't do that and why you still want to go down the assisted route, because they don't really match up. But let's say you did, you did want to avoid the use of a coach for whatever reason you decided and you're just going to go down this route. There are people like Ryan, there are people like myself, there are people like Callum, like Joe, like Dean. I can just keep rattling people's names off who provide consult in this space. That kind of way, who provide consult within this area, who can give you value and can give you direction, and can give you a certain level of peace of mind in your decision-making process.
I always use the simplest thing is, I don't know how to build a house, so I employ a builder. Like, I wouldn't try and build a fucking garden wall because I don't know how to. So I don't know why anybody would come in and be like, fuck it, I'm just going to take anabolics.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot. It's true. It's like a lot of people want their garden done, but they don't need to do it themselves. Do you know that kind of way? Like it's not. That's good enough. Like that one.
Yeah, because it's so simple. Like the things I don't know how to do, I just employ somebody who does. And then sometimes I want to learn how to do that, and I can do it for myself. And other times I just let them do it, and then just get on. And that's not because some people who are going to be competing aren't always coaches. They have a normal, regular job, and they just love competing. So at the end of the day, for me, just make the right decision and obviously doing it.
Yeah, for sure. It's true. Some people don't want the hows, the whys. They just kind of want the do's. Do this, okay.
Yeah. And I think
I've got lads who are like that. You know,
I think as educators as well, we can still educate people why they're doing it, so they have an educated reason. But also, it's like if it's just a guy who's like, oh, we'll just do some tests, do this. Most of the time, they don't understand why. They just it's just hearsay. A lot of it is just hearsay. The other thing that's just popped into my mind that I want to cover as well is the side of, obviously, sometimes we forget because obviously we're so deep in the game, but I see a lot of young guys who are like, oh, I'm going to use orals because I don't want to inject. What's your thoughts on that?
Just don't be fucking stupid.
Literally.
I think the whole idea of, going to Ibiza, I'm going to text one of the lads who knows a fella who has Anavar, and I'm going to run 25 a day for fucking, 6 weeks. Like what people don't realize, right, is that these drugs, these oral drugs, they're causing similar issues, if not worse, especially when we look at kind of like methylated orals, which is what largely, I think the only oral you can potentially run for longer term is likely Proviron because it's not methylated. But in generally, methylated orals are going to cause you problems. Winnie, Anavar, like they're going to cause you issues. And I think it's the accessibility of putting something in your mouth and it causing a response, and it's viewed similar to that. It's almost viewed like a supplement, like kind of like, ooh, that kind of way. Like, as I'm going to use this. In reality, Anavar is an anabolic androgenic steroid, and it causes protein accretion to the cell, and it also has action across other things. And one of the things and the negative things that it does have action across is largely going to be your liver and the issues that come off the back of that. And like what I would say, that if you are somebody who wants to go and change your physique for the sake of a holiday, and you're looking to go down the route of using Anavar or something along those lines, you kind of need to pull yourself in a little bit, and be like, okay, if you understood how these things work, you probably did make a different decision, that kind of way. Because like, some people just, they bank 6 weeks of it, they look good, they feel good, and nothing ever comes out the back of it. Some people do 6 weeks of it, 8 weeks of it, get no major kickback, and then a couple of years later, a couple of months later, things start to crop up, and like, what the fuck is going on? And that happen. Like, you have to remember there's a certain action on things like the high HPTA axis. So like your natural testosterone production is going to be somewhat skewed when you start using an oral version of testosterone, and then you're going to finish your holiday and you're going to come off that. A lot of the time people have no awarenesses around just how that actually works.
Well,
and the fact that
we covered that in the last video. To understand, obviously the blasting cruise sort of thing. That's, hopefully, if you haven't seen that video, go back and watch that video. But
definitely go look at it. To understand the HPTA to some degree is to understand steroids very well. If you understand one, you can generally start to understand the action and kind of why they downregulate hypothalamic feedback, and why you tend to have lower secretions of natural testosterone when you decide to go down this route. And that's another thing you need to understand before you go down this space. And something that I'm sure Calvin touched about. Again, I know you'd said kind of things you need to consider before you. Like, there's going to be a certain aspect by which if you get high enough, you're not going to be producing enough. You're not going to produce the sperm, that kind of way. You're going to be kind of like almost acutely infertile. That's something that people forget a lot of the time, that kind of way. Now, don't get me wrong. When you make the decision to go down this route, that's not something that's like, that's something just like that. There's a permanency, that kind of way. And I'm sure like, I know loads of bodybuilders who are on cycle and have kids. That kind of way. Like, it's one of those things that you run, the issue of is that when you take exogenous testosterone, you will lower and probably bottom out your own natural testosterone production. And that will be something that if you decide to come off, or you decide to do this for the long haul, you will need to consider within your approach, that kind of way. And what I always say to people is that if you're going to take probably the most sustainable and potentially, then this is going to be potentially a term that might be met, a statement that might be met with some friction by other people. Like, I personally believe blasting and cruising long term is likely more healthy than moving through a blast in a PCT period, Like the actual the kickback that you get from potentially doing a PCT and actually bottoming everything out for a period of time and going about it in potentially the best way you can, a PCT, it's just not a nice experience. Potential health implications are quite high. I've done it once, not by choice. It was horrific, if I'm honest with you, in a kind of way. So, you know, you kind of need to understand, okay, if I do decide to take myself out of this for whatever reason, how am I going to go about that? You know, you have to be able to do that to a certain. That's another thing to consider. You know,
that's one of the things I get a lot of the young guys ask. Well, they feel, okay, it's just, well, it's only anabar, it's just orals, but they don't understand the implications of it's still anabolic steroids, and it's still because his mate, like you say, his mate down the gym or fucking even his missus has used it. Then it's perfectly fine. But these are all things that are going to have to be taken into consideration, aren't they? When obviously jumping across to move into that space of obviously being assisted. The thing as well is what do you feel like? Obviously, say for example, someone's going into a prep. What is your stance on using drugs such as Tren, using drugs such as Mastron, using such drugs as Anavar for someone on the first prep?
Yeah, like, again, I'm not averse to it. I've prepped lads and I've been their first prep and I've deployed Tren. And I think when you have an understanding as to, it's similar to what I said at the start of the podcast, that you have to know why you're deploying the compound in of itself. You have to understand why you're doing it. You have to understand what that drug does well and what it doesn't do well. And when you understand those things, your deployments start to make sense. You know, so for the most part, when we look at just, we'll center the conversation largely around Tren. Okay, so Tren is just like Tren, you know, everyone's like Tren, you know, got to do some Tren, and everyone's like Tren. Everyone's like Tren's like this big, crazy, fucking scary compound, fucks with everything, makes your dick hard, makes you want to punch everyone in the face. Like it's that kind of this kind of like primordial idea around Tren that it causes all these crazy issues and stuff like that. So what Tren is very, very good at is managing catabolism, so the breakdown of tissue for the most part. So what Tren does is Tren binds to something called the glucocorticoid receptor. And in doing so, it doesn't allow cortisol to bind to that same receptor. It's like if you go and you're trying to, you know, park up at the Trafford Centre and somebody pulls into your car parking space, you can't park there anymore. That's what Tren does to the glucocorticoid receptor. And in doing so, what that does is that will lower something called MPB, which is muscle protein breakdown, which is what cortisol would have upregulated. So what you're looking at with Tren is you're looking at a drug that allows for the sustenance of lowering MPB. It allows for less catabolic action. Where does that seem like that could be a very valuable thing to do? In very low energy availability states at the back end of a prep. When your food is very, very low, your output is very, very high, you deploy Tren as a tool. And Tren as a tool then allows that kind of derogatory effect over managing the kind of compositional down regulation, if you will, of tissue, to use an unnecessarily complex term. Basically, it lowers the fact that muscle is not going to be lost. It kind of allows muscle to stay where it's supposed to be. And then there's other actions across the kind of nervous system and stuff that it does that gives the kind of that aggression, that performance element of things. And I would say that in first prep, depending on kind of why you're doing it, you know, if you're somebody who's doing a prep just to try it, I tend to avoid those egregious compounds for the most part. They just kind of give them an easy approach. If you're somebody who, in my opinion, for the most part, when you prep and you decide to compete, I think you're doing it and you should do it to compete. If you're looking to try competing, try a photo shoot and see if you get that same value from it.
100%.
You know, do a photo shoot, see if that feels any better for you. So yeah, I've deployed that on first prep, and I wouldn't be averse to it, but only because I think there's a large understanding that I have of these drugs. And I think that again, you're saying with yourself in that regard, and the fact that you're able to kind of give yourself a rational decision-making process around why you're doing that, you know, and I think if you then understand exactly why it's going in, you know, the backing of why you're doing it. I think if you're somebody who's maybe like, you know, I would call them like arbitrary prep coaches in the sense they're just going to throw drugs at people because it worked for the last guy, you know, and then you put 250, 300 training somebody who's never breathed before, and the response that that's potentially going to have on their life in general, I think you might have made a big fuck up, you know, because there is certain, you know, resultant factors that kind of come from the deployment of Tren at high levels. You know, it does turn you into a fucking nutter at times, which is why that kind of appropriate dose of 50 to 100 is more than enough than what you need. You do not need any more than that. If you think you might be able to toy around with the idea and rationalize 150 if you wanted to. But generally 150 to 50 a week for the kind of mitigation and management of MPB and kind of avoiding that massive catabolic effect that's potentially going to come from lower food volumes. You'll get what you want out of it. And then kind of antibiotics starts driving overall performance for the most part is normally what you're kind of find that for. There is a certain cosmetic effect then with things like Winstrol. And I would say, again, you understand the rationalizations behind the deployment. You're using them for shorter term periods based off their action across the liver. You're kind of pre-prepping your action post-prep to manage some of the down-regulated factors that come off the back of that. Then, yeah, I'm cool with that. You know, the kind of way I am kind of cool with that. But again, I think the biggest kind of umbrella as to why you would make that decision is down to understanding, like genuinely understanding what you're doing, and then all your decision-making processes come from that. If there's any gap in the umbrella of your understanding, you know, water's going to get in on something. You're going to have a leak. And like then you need to have that considered within your process. Even if you're a coach, like I know coaches, and I was that coach where, you know, I made decisions not fully understanding as to why I was making them. I had a conversation with a coach not too long ago where I kind of put myself in his boots, and he was like, I'm just kind of giving you a reach out. I've got a client who's prepping for this, and I just want to make sure I'm making the right move. And I was like my ignorance a few years ago never would have allowed me to do that. I was like, no, I can't ask someone else their opinion. I'm too smart. You know, don't be afraid to reach out for help, even as a coach.
Yeah, because even still, I think when you get up to, like, say, the level of everyone competing, so many different variables come in, and there's going to be so many different scenarios that yourself are coming in contact with, I've come into contact with, and it's just two brains are better than one. You know, just even if it's just a collaboration of bouncing ideas off each other and coming to the end result. But it's not. Yeah. That's what I do all the time. Like I'll message people, what do you think about this, bro? Or what do you think about that? Because at the end of the day, it's not always, even down to blood work. I'll be like, sometimes I'm like, I'm happy with that, but what do you think, bro? Like, what have you seen this pattern? Have you seen this happen? And they might just have a different view on it from experience. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, but I think as well, sorry, something to cover that just popped into my head then is,
no, not at all, man. Enjoying the conversation.
People understanding the ester. So what a lot of people tend to get wrong is they'll use propionate to harden up or whatever shit then they use, or they use Mastron propionate because of this, and Trend because of this, and what the understanding of why we can still use the long esters and still get results that we want. Do you know what I mean?
Like, like it's just when you're looking at an ester simply is almost like a tail. So if you imagine that, like, all your testosterone compounds are kind of like a little circle, your ester is essentially like a little tail, and the length of the tail dictates the rate of its either uptake, secrete, whatever way you want to refer to. There's loads of terms you can do. Basically, it's upregulation, it's management, it's clearance time essentially, and that's normally what we're kind of changing when it comes to the ester is the length of time it takes to quote unquote clear. And I think a lot of these ideas behind, you know, using faster esters closer to shows, because it's like, the idea is that, you know, it's working faster and all that kind of stupid kind of shit. In reality,
and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's in all, it's all the same thing. And I've always found that when it comes to, you know, managing the use of esters, one of the best things that you can do is just try and regulate your deployment. So what I mean by that is kind of like just have more frequent deployments of your actual compound. So so for example, me and most of my guys, we pin daily.
Yeah.
You know, I would use
this will be a thing that people will ask. So what people don't understand the concept of is microdosing.
Yeah, exactly.
People ask me, do you microdose? What is microdosing? So that basically is that, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, so microdosing is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially splitting your basal doses across the week into more frequent doses that are then going to make those doses smaller. Another word for dose smaller is, of course, micro. So you're simply microdosing. And I know that might seem like a very elementary means of kind of speaking about these things, but in large part, what you're able to do in that regard, the kind of couple of things that come from that is, one, you largely end up using insulin pins. Okay, so you're not going to microdose with a fucking 1.5 inch pin a day. I know people who do, but I personally just don't like it because I don't like pinning. As a side note, anyone who says they like pinning is weird. You know, no one likes pinning. It's uncomfortable. It's not enjoyable. It's a nuisance. But essentially, what you'll do is you will find your full weekly dose of whatever you're using. You know, normally what I do is I will get one larger syringe or whatever. I don't talk too much about that because you don't want this to get censored either. We'll put it across a single syringe, and then you'll split it across the week. That's essentially what you do. And then you have these kind of smaller micro doses of your compounds that then use daily. And when you're using insulin, the insulin is usually like an inch long, or it's kind of 5/8 of an inch long. And you'll normally deploy it kind of subcutaneously, which is kind of beneath the skin. But in large part, you end up doing it within leaner body parts. Some of it is going to be signature muscular as well. So I tend to use like kind of delts, triceps, that kind of thing. But what you're doing there is you're able to kind of, you know, mitigate, if you will, any kind of effect that the ester is going to have. 1 second, I'm going to have a mad cough. Jesus, not cool. Anyway, anyone who's just listening to that is going to get such a fright. So you're being able to just spread that across the week. So that kind of covers up the issue with, an ester. But generally all an ester is, an ester simply tells you the clearance time of that compound, how long it's going to take from administration to clearance, essentially. And, decanoate, propionate, cypionate, and anthate, they're largely going to tell you just the length of time. That's really all it is.
Yeah.
That's all it's really going to tell you. It's a time-based outcome. And that's really the only difference. It doesn't change what's in it. It doesn't really change what it is. It doesn't change the kind of effect that it has for the most part. I did see something recently where it's kind of like based off ester, that the actual total milligrams might shift a little bit, but I didn't, it was actually in German, so I didn't read it enough. And I don't know how aware I am. I've got a client who lives in Vienna, and he shared something. I have to look into it a little bit more, but it wasn't really making too much sense. So I'm probably going to ignore it for the most part. But in general, that's really the only difference when it comes to esters, and every single kind of, compound that we take to use will have some form of an ester, if you will. It'll have some derivative of something that kind of changes the way that it's used. It'll change the way that it's taken. It'll kind of dictate the way that it's cleared, but in large part, if you have test CYP, test P, test E, it's all the same thing.
Yes, that's what people don't understand. They think if they change from test CYP to test E, they're going to get more results because of the androgen receptor they're going to get, and it's just wrong. And that's the thing as well, is I think getting people to understand the difference between esters, because they don't understand. Obviously, it's just an ester. It's not actually the drugs are not going to be any better. Because I think you froze, bro. You still there? Come back, Ross. Come back. Hello. You look so pretty like this, by the way. Hopefully we're getting back. No. Oh shit. Bro, you there? I've just made him bigger. Oh, he's gone. So guys, really sorry, he's obviously his internet's fucked up. But there's just a brief overview of obviously what I'm trying to get across in this video is the considerations you need to take before starting, obviously stepping across into assisted, and then also how to then put these drugs into place. So looking at, say, like me and Ross just discussed, looking at testosterone as the baseline, and then looking at the tolerance of that, and looking at a longer module rather than just a short-term 8-week cycle or a short-term 12-week cycle. And then obviously being able to layer drugs on top of that to then obviously have the desired effect. The other things that you want to consider obviously is looking at blood work. So getting blood work in and getting somebody to read that blood work, and obviously so we know where you're at in health-wise, and then also supplementation. Hopefully this gives you a decent overview of obviously the considerations you need to take and the steps you need to take. Main thing I think to take away from this video is just really, really educate yourself before taking this step, because once you do, it's a long-term investment. And then obviously hire a coach if you've got the affordability and the means to, and then also just understand that the reason you should be taking these anabolic steroids are, oh, sorry, 1 second. Ross is back. Let's see if we can get him back in. And you're back in the room. I don't know what happened then, bro. I was just recapping the whole video, to be fair. I kind of
that was a good call, man. Jesus, it's actually my Wi-Fi.
There was a picture. I'm not actually ended the recording yet. The picture of you, it froze. You look so pretty, and I made it bigger by accident. So, but no, I was just recapping the whole thing that we talk about. Basically, I was just recapping, saying the considerations that the people need to take before making the leap across to assisted, and then also things that they're going to have to obviously understand before they do this, like blood work and supplementation and so on. Yeah, so I was just recapping that, but no, I really appreciate you coming on, bro. Even if you,
I appreciate it, man. I think if say one thing, just don't go into this half-arsed. Like, don't have any half-arsed thoughts around what you think it is. The responsibility that you then have off the back of it. Just have a genuine think about what the things are that you need to do and to consider before going into this realm. Like me and Ryan are both assisted athletes. Like we're not people who are sitting there telling you, don't ever do this, it's bad for you. You know, we want to encourage people to have a thought process and understanding of kind of what it takes to manage your overall health. And like, don't go in there thinking, you know, like, fuck my health, you know, that kind of way. Like, just go in there with an idea of the fact that whether it's bodybuilding or whatever sport that's kind of, you want to go down the assisted route in order to manage, it's not going to be forever. You know, and the idea of you thinking about your later life is not like uncool. It's not less hardcore. You know, going down these potentially safer use models is a massive, there's a massive problem with people thinking that they're going to be less effective. It's not true. No, it's really, really not. You can get the same level of results you get, if not better, because you can sustain the actual intake and the input of that signal for longer. You know, it's a massive argument to be had towards that. It's just a matter of just thinking a little bit more clear on it. If you do need any help, reach out to someone like me, Ryan, Callum Racerick, Joe Jeffrey. There's people out there who are willing to help and who are armed with the tools to help you if you need it.
100%. Thank you for that, bro. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, buddy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, bro.